The flames of bonfires, the crackling of wooden grids, and the screams that pierced through the stone walls of monastery basements were the everyday backdrop of late medieval Europe. The Inquisition, designed to protect the purity of the faith, became a machine of pain, with women as its main victims. Their bodies were seen not as the flesh of living human beings, but as vessels of the devil, subject to purification through torture. That is why the instruments created to humiliate and destroy the female body were designed with particular care. Among them, the vaginal screw occupied a special place, a metal instrument which, as chroniclers wrote, revealed lies through the flesh. The first stage was always a public demonstration of the power of the church. The woman was brought out into the square or into the hall of the Inquisition court. She was already in a state of extreme exhaustion after weeks of imprisonment, during which she was kept in damp conditions without food, with her hands tied. Witnesses of that time left records that detainees were almost always deliberately brought to a state of near death. They were deprived of sleep, fed rotten bread, and given dirty water to drink. All this destroyed their resistance even before the interrogations began. When it was time for the interrogation, the Inquisitor read the charges: witchcraft, communication with demons, intercourse with the devil, participation in Sabbaths. For women of that time, it was often enough to be rumored to be a midwife or herbalist to end up in the hands of the executioners. The interrogation process itself was designed so that the accused could not justify herself. Any word was considered either a confession or a lie confirming guilt. The vaginal screw was used when it was necessary to extract a confession of contact with demons or to show the assembled crowd physical proof of the woman's connection with evil forces. This instrument was a metal cylinder that was inserted into the body and then slowly twisted with a special lever. The petals began to spread apart, tearing the tissue. The chronicles mention that the metal was heated over coals to increase the suffering. The woman screamed so loudly that even hardened soldiers turned away. But for the Inquisitor, this was a sign that the soul was resisting purification. Such torture was always accompanied by prayers and the reading of psalms. This creates a particularly eerie contrast. Words of mercy and salvation sounded against the backdrop of screams and the crunching of human flesh. The executioners acted methodically, pausing so that the victim could lose consciousness and wake up again. Historians who have analyzed the records of the Inquisition trials note that many women died during the interrogation stage. However, the Church sought to bring the process to its conclusion, to a public burning, which was intended to be a spectacle of intimidation. Burning was perceived not simply as execution, but as a purifying ritual. When a woman found guilty was tortured and signed a confession, she was taken to the square. Crowds gathered in advance, peasants, artisans, children. For them, it was a spectacle and a lesson that reinforced the power of the Church. The condemned woman was tied to a wooden stake. Wood was piled around her, and sometimes sulfur was added to make the flames higher and thicker. Witnesses described how the smell of burning flesh mixed with smoke and screams, and spectators saw this as proof of the victory of faith. But before the fire engulfed the body, the woman was often already disfigured. Torture with vaginal screws and other instruments caused such damage that she could barely stand. Chronicles from Spain and Germany at the end of the 15th century record cases where the victim was carried to the stake on a stretcher because she could not walk. Even at such moments, the Church emphasized that this was an act of mercy, because, according to them, the soul was saved through suffering. Doctors of that era, who were at the courts of monarchs or inquisitorial tribunals, sometimes recorded injuries after torture. The surviving descriptions mention deep lacerations of the mucous membranes, tissue necrosis, and massive bleeding. All this was presented as proof of the unclean nature of women, as if their bodies themselves testified against them. But in reality, these were traces of torture, covered up by religious rhetoric. The psychological aspect was also significant. A woman subjected to such procedures not only suffered physically, but also experienced humiliation in front of the entire city. For the society of that time, female honor was a crucial category, and its destruction through public torture meant not only the death of the body, but also the complete destruction of memory and reputation. Even the families of the condemned were subjected to shame. Their property was confiscated, and their children were declared tainted by blood. Gradually, the practice of using vaginal screws and other specialized instruments spread throughout Europe. From Spain and France, it moved to the Holy Roman Empire, where blacksmiths created increasingly sophisticated models. Some instruments were equipped with additional spikes or barbs. In collections that have survived to this day, you can see devices resembling a metal flower that opened up inside the human body. These exhibits are now displayed in torture museums, but in their time, they served as instruments of oppression. In this way, the Inquisition turned female sexuality and the body itself into a battlefield. Where the Church saw purification of the soul, what actually took place was the destruction of flesh and personality. This dissonance between official rhetoric and actual practices creates one of the darkest legacies of that era. In many archives that have preserved the records of Inquisition trials, one can see how carefully the details were recorded. Dates, names, lists of crimes. But behind the dry lines lay a monstrous reality. For example, the files of the Toledo Tribunal from the late 15th century contain records of women accused of secret relations with an unclean spirit. The wording was extremely vague, but it allowed anyone who seemed suspicious to be tortured. These documents show that interrogations could last for weeks, and with each passing day, the instruments became more and more brutal. The executioners who served the tribunals were not just craftsmen. They were people raised in the ideology of salvation through pain. They often took pride in their work, considering it a continuation of the Church's mission. At the same time, however, there is evidence that for a good price, they could show leniency, loosen the screw, or give the victim a chance to catch their breath. This created a whole system of corruption in which a woman's suffering became a resource for profit. Among the sophisticated tortures used in parallel with vaginal screws was the so-called hot seat. The woman was seated on an iron plate, heated to red hot. The body was instantly burned, the skin stuck to the metal, and every movement caused new damage. Sometimes the inquisitors combined this method with a screw inserted inside, intensifying the agony. Historians note that such practices were documented in Bavaria and Switzerland, where the courts sought to show particular cruelty in order to intimidate the population. Midwives and herbalists had a particularly hard time. They were accused of knowledge beyond the nature of women. In one of the trials in Nuremberg in the 16th century, a woman confessed under torture that she had used wormwood infusion to ease childbirth. For the inquisitors, this was proof of witchcraft. During interrogation, a screw was inserted into her and slowly turned, demanding that she name her accomplices. Under unbearable pain, she uttered dozens of names of her neighbors, who then also ended up in the court's basements. The bonfires after such trials turned into mass spectacles. In Cologne, there is a preserved description of an execution where 3 women were burned at the same time. Before their execution, their genitals were completely mutilated. Chroniclers wrote that the devil's gates were destroyed by fire. These words reflect not only cruelty, but also the Church's obsessive idea that the female body is a source of sin and must be eradicated. It is important to understand that burning at the stake was not an instant death. Depending on how the wood was stacked, the execution could last from a few minutes to an hour. If the fire was too low, the women suffocated from the smoke, but remained conscious until the flames reached their breasts. To speed up the process, executioners sometimes smeared the body with resin or poured oil on it. In Spain, under Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, this became common practice. The execution had to be spectacular and edifying. Doctors and scientists of the modern era, who gained access to the documents of the Inquisition, were shocked by the details. In the 16th century, the German physician Johann Weyer wrote that, under the guise of fighting witchcraft, the lives and bodies of innocent people are being destroyed. His writings condemned the methods of the Inquisition, but at the time, they were considered heretical. The very fact that a doctor recorded the consequences of torture shows that even in that era, there was an understanding that this was not purification, but systematic destruction. The social consequences were enormous. Fear paralyzed entire villages. Women stopped passing on their knowledge of herbs and were afraid to help women in labor. This led to an increase in mortality during childbirth and the death of infants. Thus, religious terror directed against witches directly affected the demographics and health of society. Men, witnessing public torture, internalized the idea that the female body was an object of punishment and humiliation. This cultural imprint remained for centuries, shaping perceptions of power and subordination. And yet, even in these conditions, there were women who did not give up. In the archives, there are records of defendants who remained silent to the end, despite torture. Such cases were recorded in particular detail to emphasize the persistence of evil. But in reality, they show incredible strength and resilience. These women went to their deaths without confessing, breaking the pattern of a court system that relied on forced confessions. Thus, the history of inquisitorial torture reveals not only physical destruction, but also an entire mechanism of power, where pain became an instrument of social control. And at the center of this mechanism were always women, whose bodies were turned into a field for demonstrating fear. In different regions of Europe, the practice of inquisitorial torture had its own characteristics, but the general principle remained unchanged. Women were seen as vessels of devilish power, and their bodies as the main object of evidence. In 16th century France, for example, special screw crowns were used, metal devices that were placed on the head and squeezed the skull, causing bleeding from the eyes and ears. But it was vaginal and anal instruments that were most often used against women as a symbolic destruction of their sinful gates. In Italy, where the Vatican kept issues of purity of faith under special control, Improved versions of vaginal screws were used. The archives of the Roman Curia contain descriptions of instruments that were shaped like spreading petals, equipped with sharp teeth. When twisted, these teeth tore the tissue, causing profuse bleeding. Women were often subjected to this procedure several times in a row between interrogations, so that they would not forget their guilt. In the Holy Roman Empire, especially in the German principalities, executioners preferred to combine screws with the Iron Maiden, a sarcophagus equipped with spikes. Although the myth of the maiden as an everyday instrument of torture is often exaggerated, in a number of cases, wooden analogues with metal needles were indeed used, where women were placed for a short time to increase pressure and fear. After that, the victim was taken out and the screw was applied again, reinforcing the idea of torment as the only possible outcome. In the Netherlands and Flanders, where witch hunts became widespread in the 17th century, torture methods became as efficient as possible. Women were subjected to serial interrogations involving several executioners at once. A special place was given to the practice of checking for witch marks. The body was stripped naked and examined in front of witnesses, and then the insides were examined with a screw in search of the mark of the devil. This turned into not only physical, but also public sexual humiliation, destroying human dignity. In England, although the Inquisition, in its classical Catholic form, did not take root, the persecution of witches was also severe. Here, the so-called wheels of trial and suspension by the arms were more commonly used. However, in private prisons and torture chambers, especially during the time of Cromwell, devices similar to continental screws were found. Witnesses noted that women accused of fornication with the devil were subjected to the same procedures as on the mainland. The evolution of torture instruments went hand in hand with the development of metallurgy. In the 15th and 16th centuries, blacksmiths who worked for the courts created increasingly complex mechanisms. Some screws had several opening modes, from narrow for a quick check to wide, which caused fatal internal injuries. In the surviving collections, you can see devices with handles decorated with symbols of the cross or even engraved psalms. Thus, the religious context was literally built into the instrument of torture. Interestingly, in Portugal and Spain, where one of the most powerful inquisitions operated, vaginal screws were considered a purely female instrument. Men were more often subjected to suspension, stretching, and joint compression. For women, there was a whole set of instruments aimed specifically at destroying the reproductive sphere. This emphasizes the special perception of the female body as a source of threat to faith and morality. Differences between countries were also evident in the execution process itself. In Germany, preliminary suffocation was more commonly practiced so that the woman would die before the flames engulfed her body. In Spain, on the contrary, the aim was to prolong the agony as long as possible, believing that suffering until the last breath was the main proof of purification. In Italy, victims were sometimes subjected to ritual haircutting before burning, symbolically depriving them of their feminine power. These practices were not secret. On the contrary, they served as a tool of public intimidation. People knew that a woman's body could become a target for trial at any moment if it was deemed suspicious. This created an atmosphere of constant fear and submission. Even when the actual witch hunts came to an end, the memory of such spectacles lived on among the people for many generations, forming a culture of silence and submission. Thus, when comparing different countries, it becomes clear that despite variations in instruments and procedures, the essence remained the same. Women in Europe during the Inquisition were not simply human beings, but objects of control, whose bodies could be turned into a showcase of religious and political power at any moment. Chronicles and personal accounts from people who lived through it give us a sense of how executions and torture were seen by society. They almost always show a mix of horror and familiarity. People who saw these scenes noted them as part of everyday life, but their descriptions slip in details that make it clear that even the toughest folks were shocked. The surviving city chronicles of Nuremberg for the 16th century record, "Today, a woman accused of consorting with Satan was brought to the square near St. Sebald's Church. Her body was barely holding up after the interrogations, and the executioners led her by the arms. The people watched in silence. Only the children laughed and pointed." This brief testimony highlights an important point. For the townspeople, such spectacles were not only frightening, but also a kind of educational lesson for children, who were shown the power of the ecclesiastical court from an early age. Other sources have preserved much more gruesome details. A monk in Speyer in the mid-15th century described torture with a vaginal screw. The red-hot iron was inserted into the woman's private parts, and when it opened, she screamed so loudly that the walls shook. But the Lord gave us the strength to endure her cries, for it was the voice of the devil, not her own. This fragment not only records the use of the instrument, but also shows how people of that time justified the torture. The woman's cry ceased to be her voice. It was declared to be the voice of a demon. Bystanders reacted in different ways. In some cases, the crowd expressed sympathy, threw flowers at the feet of the condemned woman, or wept with her children. But much more often, sources record cold indifference or even joy. In Switzerland in the 17th century, eyewitnesses recorded how the crowd applauded when the flames engulfed the stake and shouted, "Burn, witch!" It was a form of collective catharsis when fear of the church turned into aggression against the victim. Equally important are the testimonies of foreigners. Italian travelers who visited Germany during the Reformation noted extraordinary cruelty towards women. One of them wrote, "I saw a woman accused of witchcraft being torn apart from within with iron and then burned. The people watched with curiosity, as if it were a performance. The children's faces were calm, as if they were used to such things." These words are particularly frightening because they show that executions became part of the cultural code, shaping an entire generation for whom human suffering was commonplace. Some chronicles even contain descriptions of the sounds and smells. A chronicler from Strasbourg wrote, "The smell was so bad that many covered their faces with cloaks, but no one left the square." This testimony suggests that attending executions was almost a mandatory social act. People could turn away, but they did not leave, because that was considered a sign of suspicion. Sometimes there are also words of doubt. In the diary of a French notary from the mid-16th century, there is a line, "I saw a woman being tortured with a screw, and my heart trembled. I thought, is the devil not pleased with such a spectacle?" Such phrases are rare, but they make it clear that not everyone accepted the official rhetoric. Some were aware of its cruel nature. It is important to note that women's voices have been almost entirely lost. Under torture, women either left no records or their words were recorded by court transcribers and distorted. The little that has come down to us are fragments of confessions, often coerced. The horror is palpable. I did what I was told to do to make the pain stop. These words from the minutes of the Inquisition in Leon in the 17th century sound like the only testimony of a living person, not a figure in a court case. Thus, the chronicles and testimonies of contemporaries reveal a two-layered reality. Officially, it was a battle with the devil, but in reality, it was a demonstration of power, where human suffering was turned into a spectacle. Crowds stood frozen in front of the fires. Children learned to watch the torment without pity, and the rare voices of doubt were drowned out by the roar of the crowd and the crackling of the fire. The consequences of centuries of inquisitorial torture for European society were devastating, not only at the level of individual lives, but also in terms of the culture, medicine, and psychology of entire generations. The terror directed at women changed the very fabric of everyday life and shaped a collective perception of pain, fear, and power that persisted long after the fires had died down. First and foremost, knowledge suffered. Women, midwives, herbalists, healers had been the main bearers of practical medicine for centuries. They knew how to ease childbirth, how to treat colds, and how to heal wounds with herbs. But the Inquisition declared this knowledge to be witchcraft and destroyed it along with its bearers. According to historians in the German lands alone, tens of thousands of women were executed over 2 centuries, many of whom had experience in healing. This meant that society consciously deprived itself of medical care, especially in villages where there were no doctors. As a result, mortality during childbirth rose sharply. The chronicles of the 17th century often mention women who died during their first contractions and babies who died due to incorrect techniques. What had previously been resolved using traditional methods was now lost. Male doctors trained at universities refused for a long time to treat women's diseases, considering them dirty and shameful. This created a vacuum in which women's suffering became the norm. The social consequences were no less catastrophic. Fear of the Inquisition forced families to watch each other. Women were forbidden to gather together, especially at night. Any meeting could be interpreted as a coven. Neighbors informed on each other in the hope of protecting themselves. Thus, society was torn apart by internal suspicions. Where there had once been a tradition of mutual aid among women, a culture of silence and alienation emerged. Torture had a particular impact on the perception of the female body. It became a symbol of sin, a source of danger, and an object of constant control. Men learned from public executions that a woman's body could be punished and destroyed by the authorities without resistance. This reinforced patriarchal structures, where female submission was perceived as natural. In the centuries that followed, this idea permeated literature, painting, and everyday morality. The cultural imprint of these practices was also evident in language. Expressions such as cleansing by fire or expelling pain through suffering became part of religious and everyday discourse. Even prayer books contained phrases justifying suffering as a path to salvation. For millions of people, pain ceased to be an exception and became the norm of existence. Interestingly, it was against the backdrop of the Inquisition that the science of evidence and legal procedure began to take shape. In the 18th century, Enlightenment philosophers studying the archives were horrified by the number of confessions obtained under torture. This became one of the arguments in favor of court reform. But for women, these changes came too late. Generations had been destroyed. The memory of healers had been erased, and the fear of witchcraft accusations lived on among the people for a long time. Equally important was the impact on the psyche of society. Children who saw the bonfires and heard the screams grew up in a world where human life was worthless in the face of religious authority. This bred cruelty, which then manifested itself in wars and civil strife. For centuries, Europe remained a continent where violence was seen as a normal tool of governance. That is why historians believe that the Inquisition was not just a religious institution, but also a powerful social experiment in mind control. Through the public torture of women, the Church formed a new society, obedient, frightened, ready to obey even the most cruel decrees. And although the witch hunt officially ended, its consequences were felt for many centuries, determining attitudes towards women, knowledge, and the very idea of human dignity. The memory of the torture suffered by women during the Inquisition was preserved not only in court archives and chronicles, but also in culture, folklore, and even scientific works. This legacy became part of the collective consciousness of Europe, transforming into legends, everyday expressions, and medical treatises, continuing to influence the perception of the female body and the role of women in society for many centuries to come. Images of witches at the stake have been preserved in village legends and songs. These stories were told to children as a warning: don't break the rules, or you will suffer the same fate as your neighbor who was burned at the stake. Often, images of witches were intertwined with motifs of disease and natural disasters. It was believed that the death of a woman in fire could appease the plague or stop the hail. Thus, religious terror became entrenched in oral culture as an explanation for disasters and a means of preventing them. In modern literature, the memory of executions manifested itself in the images of seductresses and sorceresses. French and German plays of the 17th century often depicted women whose beauty led men to their doom and were punished by death by fire. Even as the era of witch hunts faded, the stereotype remained in the popular imagination. Women were the source of evil, and punishment through pain was natural. These ideas found their way into novels, ballads, and theatrical productions, forming the canon of the fatal woman, whose roots lie precisely in the practices of the Inquisition. It is equally telling that the memory of torture was also enshrined in medical texts. In the 16th and 17th centuries, treatises on gynecology often included references to female abnormalities, explained through ideas imposed by the Church. Doctors recorded cases of ruptures and damage to internal organs, but interpreted them not as a consequence of torture, but as proof of a connection with demons or congenital depravity. Even decades after the end of the mass trials, medical discourse continued to justify violence. In folklore, especially in Germanic and Scandinavian lands, images of women with iron inside or open flowers of pain emerged, distorted memories of vaginal screws. These legends were passed down as horror stories in which the devil allegedly opens a woman's body from the inside. But if you compare them carefully with archival data, it becomes clear that this is a folk interpretation of real torture, which so shocked the imagination that it turned into a mythological motif. Baroque artists also left evidence of this memory. In engravings and paintings depicting the victory of the church over witches, one can see details clearly inspired by inquisitorial executions. Stakes, bonfires, women's bodies bound in iron. These images became part of visual culture, reproduced over and over again, even when the actual practice had already faded away. Art, consciously or not, reinforced the trauma, turning it into a canon. Even architecture bears traces of those times. In cities in Germany, Spain, Italy, and France, there are still buildings that once housed Inquisition prisons. In some of them, basements with hooks, iron rings, and traces of fires have been preserved. Over time, these places became overgrown with legends. Residents said that at night you could hear women screaming or the clanging of chains. Thus, the memory of torture did not disappear, but became part of urban folklore. The transformation of fear into an educational tool was of particular importance. Even 100 years after the end of the mass trials, mothers frightened their daughters with the words, "If you are disobedient, they will take you away as a witch." This threat, based on the memory of real events, shaped women's obedience and subordination. As a result, the practices of the Inquisition continued to operate, albeit no longer in the form of fire and screws, but in the form of collective memory and social norms. Thus, inquisitorial torture left not only physical, but also cultural scars. They entered legends, fairy tales, art, medicine, and morality, reinforcing the idea of women as dangerous, sinful beings who must be controlled. This memory became an invisible but solid foundation for many social structures, and its traces can still be felt today. Today, when historical science turns to the legacy of the Inquisition, it is not only a matter of recording facts, but also of attempting to understand how centuries of terror changed the very structure of European society. Contemporary researchers emphasize that the torture of women was not a random excess or a mistake of the era. It was built into a system of power that deliberately used pain and humiliation as a means of control. Archives preserved in Toledo, Seville, Nuremberg, Basel, and other centers make it possible to reconstruct the course of the trials day by day. They show that every procedure, from imprisonment to burning at the stake, was strictly regulated. Torture was described in official language as if it were a matter of economic expenses or road repairs. It is this bureaucracy of pain that strikes researchers. Suffering was formalized, turned into part of the administrative mechanism. 20th century historians such as Henry Charles Lee and Carlo Ginzburg have shown that the Inquisition not only destroyed dissidents, but also shaped a new social order. Women occupied a subordinate position in this order. Their bodies were considered dangerous and their voices suspicious. This model persisted even after the tribunals were abolished, becoming part of family and social practices. Contemporary feminist researchers, analyzing the trial materials, emphasized that the witch hunt was the largest campaign of systematic violence against women in history. The scale, tens and according to some estimates, hundreds of thousands of victims, makes it one of the most horrific examples of institutionalized gender-based genocide. And although the official goal was to combat heresy, the real victims were women's autonomy, knowledge, and ability to resist. The most important task of modern science is to restore lost voices. Scientists analyze confession records, trying to hear the real women behind them. Even in distorted recordings, one can detect desperate attempts to save children, justify neighbors, and preserve dignity. These tiny fragments restore humanity to those who for centuries were represented only as witches. The study of cultural memory is no less important. Torture museums, exhibitions about witches, scientific conferences, all of this reminds society of the trauma that shaped European civilization. For many, this is a revelation. Behind the majestic cathedrals and treatises on faith lie dungeons where women were broken. Contemporary documentary filmmakers and writers strive to show not only the horrors of torture itself, but also how it affected everyday life, families, and language. Today, this topic takes on special significance in the context of human rights. Researchers point out that understanding the history of the Inquisition helps us understand how easily state and religious structures can justify violence with higher goals. This is a warning to modern society. Whenever pain is justified with words such as salvation, purity, or security, the way is opened to a repetition of the horrors of the past. The conclusion of historians is clear. The torture of women during the Inquisition was not a private practice, but the foundation of a system of fear that entrenched submissiveness and destroyed women's knowledge for centuries. This is not just a dark page in history, but one of the cornerstones of European history, without an understanding of which it is impossible to comprehend the origins of many contemporary inequalities. And that is precisely why the memory of the fires, the screws and the screams must not be lost. It must serve as a warning about what happens when power, religious fanaticism, and the desire to subjugate the human body come together.